In 1460, two brothers stood on opposite sides of a battlefield, ready to destroy each other for a crown that would curse whoever wore it. What started as a family disagreement spiraled into 30 years of bloodshed that would tear England apart and redefine the very meaning of betrayal. This is the story of the Wars of the Roses, where royal siblings became mortal enemies, where 7-year-old princes ordered executions, and where uncles murdered their own nephews for power. But here's the shocking twist. The war meant to save England from a mad king nearly destroyed the monarchy itself. Hit that like button and subscribe for more dark tales from history's bloodiest family feuds. The icy December wind swept across the fields of Wakefield when two brothers looked at each other for the last time before becoming mortal enemies. It was 1460, and England bled in a war that had not begun between strangers, but between members of the same royal family who had once played together in the gardens of the same castle, shared the same tutors, and sworn to protect each other until death. Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were blood brothers, who now found themselves on opposite sides of a battle that would define not only who would rule England, but what kind of scar would be forever etched into the soul of the English nation. What began as a political dispute transformed into the Wars of the Roses, a fratricidal conflict that would last 3 decades and cost the lives of an entire generation of English nobility. The seed of discord had been planted long before, when King Henry VI lost his mind and England plunged into the deepest political chaos of its medieval history. Henry was a man too pious to be king in an age that demanded iron fists and hearts of stone. His bouts of madness left the kingdom without leadership for months, while ambitious nobles circled the throne like hungry vultures, each believing they had the divine right to rule. The House of Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose, had controlled the throne for decades, but the House of York, symbolized by the White Rose, began to question this legitimacy with arguments that mixed hereditary right with thirst for power in proportions that no one could any longer distinguish. The making of a usurper. Richard, Duke of York, was a 48-year-old man who had spent his entire life waiting for his chance to rule. Tall, imposing, with blue eyes that seemed to burn with contained ambition, he sincerely believed he had more right to the throne than the king himself. His lineage traced back to Edward III through 2 different lines, a genealogical inheritance that he treasured in his heart like a sacred treasure, and a justification for all his future actions. Richard saw Henry VI not merely as a usurper, but as a weak man who was destroying England with his inability to govern. Each day that passed under Lancastrian rule was, for Richard, a day stolen from the legitimate destiny of his family and his homeland. The Duke of York's claim was not without merit, though it was certainly not without complications. Through his mother, Anne Mortimer, he descended from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the second son of Edward III. Through his father, he traced his line to Edmund, Duke of York, the 4th son of the same king. This double inheritance gave him what many legal scholars of the time considered a superior claim to that of Henry VI, whose Lancastrian line descended from John of Gaunt, Edward III's 3rd son, but through a line that had been legitimized only after the fact. Richard carried these genealogical charts in his mind like a battle map, each name and date a weapon in his arsenal of legitimacy. But Richard was more than just a claimant with a strong pedigree. He was also one of the most capable military commanders and administrators of his generation. During his time as Lieutenant of Ireland, he had brought peace to a land that had known little but warfare for decades. His governance of his own territories showed an efficiency and justice that stood in stark contrast to the chaos that emanated from Henry VI's court. Those who knew Richard personally spoke of a man of deep conviction, one who genuinely believed that his assumption of the throne would benefit not just his family, but all of England. The she-wolf of France. On the other side of the approaching civil war stood Marguerite of Anjou, the French queen who had married Henry VI and become the true force behind the Lancastrian throne. Marguerite was everything her husband was not: fierce, determined, politically astute, and completely devoid of the scruples that limited more noble men. She saw Richard of York not as a legitimate rival, but as a traitor who needed to be crushed before he destroyed everything she had built in England. The French queen transformed the dynastic dispute into a personal war, using her sharp intelligence and calculated cruelty to mobilize all the crown's resources against the Yorkists who dared challenge her authority. Marguerite's background had prepared her well for the brutal realities of English politics. Born into the sophisticated but ruthless court of Marguerite of Anjou, she had learned from childhood that survival in royal circles required not just intelligence and beauty, but also the willingness to eliminate threats before they could mature. Her marriage to Henry VI had been arranged as part of a peace treaty with France, but she had transformed what could have been merely a diplomatic alliance into a genuine partnership, albeit one where she increasingly became the dominant partner as Henry's mental health deteriorated. The Queen's transformation from foreign bride to English political leader was remarkable in its speed and thoroughness. Within a few years of her arrival in England, she had mastered the complex web of noble alliances that determined political power in the kingdom. She understood that the English nobility respected strength above all else, and she made sure to demonstrate that strength at every opportunity. When courtiers whispered that she was too young, too foreign, or too female to wield real power, she responded by outmaneuvering them so thoroughly that they learned to fear rather than dismiss her. Marguerite's greatest asset was her ability to inspire loyalty in those who served her. Unlike many queens who relied on their husband's authority, she built her own power base through a combination of generosity to her supporters and ruthlessness toward her enemies. She rewarded those who served her well with lands, titles, and positions at court, creating a network of nobles who had personal reasons to support the Lancastrian cause. At the same time, she made examples of those who opposed her, ensuring that potential rebels understood the consequences of disloyalty. The First Blood. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 was merely the appetizer of a feast of blood that would last decades. Richard of York won easily, captured the Mad King, and for a moment it seemed the war had ended before it had even begun. But Marguerite of Anjou was not the type of woman who accepted defeat with grace. She regrouped the Lancastrian forces in northern England, where the people were more loyal to the House of Lancaster, and began planning a revenge that would be as brutal as it was effective. The Queen knew that in a civil war, mercy was a weakness that could cost not just battles, but entire dynasties. The aftermath of St. Albans revealed the fundamental differences in how the two sides viewed the conflict. Richard of York treated his victory as a political correction, believing that capturing the king and eliminating a few troublesome nobles would restore proper governance to England. He made the mistake of thinking that his opponents shared his relatively civilized view of political conflict. Marguerite, however, understood that this was not a gentleman's disagreement to be resolved through negotiation, but a struggle for survival that would end only when one side completely destroyed the other. The Queen's preparations for the next phase of the war demonstrated her superior understanding of the conflict's true nature. While Richard returned to his estates, confident that his victory had settled the matter, Marguerite travelled throughout the north, personally appealing to lords and commoners alike. She reminded them of the loyalty their families had shown to the Lancastrian dynasty for generations, and she painted the Yorkist rebellion not as a legitimate dynastic dispute, but as an attack on the established order that threatened everyone's security. Her efforts were remarkably successful. The north of England had prospered under Lancastrian rule, and many of its nobles had personal ties to the royal family stretching back decades. More importantly, Marguerite understood how to speak to different audiences. To the great lords, she offered confirmation of their existing privileges and hints of greater rewards to come. To the lesser nobles, she promised advancement and opportunity. To the common people, she presented herself as their protector against Yorkist tyranny. This broad-based appeal gave her access to resources that Richard had not anticipated. The trap at Wakefield. Richard made the fatal error of underestimating his enemy's determination. In December 1460, he marched north with a smaller army than necessary, confident that his previous victory had broken the Lancastrian spirit. But when he arrived at Wakefield, he discovered he had fallen into a carefully prepared trap. The Lancastrians had concentrated forces far superior to his own, and Richard found himself surrounded in a castle that quickly transformed from safe refuge to royal tomb. The Battle of Wakefield would be remembered not just as a military defeat, but as the moment when the Wars of the Roses lost any semblance of civility and transformed into a conflict of mutual extermination. The strategic situation at Wakefield revealed both Richard's military acumen and his political blind spots. The Duke of York had chosen to winter at Sandal Castle, a strong defensive position that should have provided security for his relatively small force. His plan was sound from a military perspective: wait for reinforcements from his allies in the south, while maintaining a threatening presence in the north. What Richard failed to account for was the depth of Lancastrian preparation and the extent of local support for Marguerite's cause. The Queen had spent months carefully positioning her forces throughout the region, using her network of loyal nobles to coordinate a trap of unprecedented sophistication. Rather than simply gathering a large army and marching toward Wakefield, she had orchestrated a complex operation that involved multiple forces converging on Richard's position while cutting off his escape routes. Local Lancastrian sympathizers provided intelligence about Richard's movements and strength, ensuring that Marguerite knew exactly when and how to spring her trap. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical execution by the Lancastrian commanders. They used the terrain to their advantage, positioning archers on high ground that commanded the approaches to Sandal Castle. When Richard's forces emerged to engage what they thought was a small raiding party, they found themselves facing a much larger army than expected. The Yorkist retreat to the castle became a rout as Lancastrian cavalry struck their flanks and rear. Within hours, what had seemed like a secure position became a death trap for the Duke of York and his followers. The death of innocence Edmund, Earl of Rutland, was only 17 years old when he died at Wakefield. He was Richard of York's second son, a young man who had grown up believing that someday he would be Duke or Earl of some prosperous land, that he would marry well and live a life of honor and privilege typical of the English high nobility. Edmund was not a born warrior like his older brother Edward, nor a cunning politician like his father. He was simply an aristocratic teenager who found himself dragged into a war he did not fully understand, fighting for causes he had inherited along with his title and lineage. When the Lancastrians overran Wakefield, Edmund tried to flee, but was captured by Lord Clifford, a man whose thirst for revenge had been sharpened by the death of his own father in the previous battle. Edmund's death was an act of cruelty that shocked even the brutal standards of the time. Lord Clifford, known as the Butcher, was not content to simply kill an adolescent prisoner of war. He made a point of humiliating the youth before executing him, reminding him that his father had killed Lancastrian nobles and that now it was time to pay for those crimes with Yorkist blood. "Your father killed mine, and now I kill you and all yours," Clifford said, before plunging his sword into the boy's heart. Edmund's death transformed a political dispute into a personal vendetta that would poison relations between the two houses for generations. The circumstances of Edmund's capture and execution revealed the complete breakdown of medieval codes of chivalry that had traditionally governed warfare between nobles. In earlier conflicts, prisoners of high birth were routinely ransomed rather than killed, both because they represented valuable assets and because treating captives with honor was seen as essential to maintaining the social order. The deliberate murder of a 17-year-old earl marked a turning point in English civil warfare, signaling that traditional restraints no longer applied. Lord Clifford's motivation for this act of brutality was deeply personal. His father, Thomas Clifford, had been killed at the First Battle of St. Albans, and the younger Clifford blamed Richard of York personally for that death. In his mind, killing Edmund was not murder, but justice, an eye for an eye that balanced the scales of family honor. This logic would become increasingly common as the war progressed, with each atrocity justifying the next in an endless cycle of revenge that consumed entire bloodlines. The impact of Edmund's death on his family was devastating. For Richard of York, the loss of his second son represented not just personal grief, but a fundamental challenge to his understanding of the conflict. He had believed that the war was about political principles and dynastic rights, conducted according to established rules of noble behavior. The murder of his teenage son forced him to confront the reality that his enemies were prepared to use any means necessary to destroy him and everything he represented. The mockery of ambition. Richard of York died fighting like a cornered lion, but his death was only the beginning of the humiliation the Lancastrians had planned. Marguerite of Anjou ordered that the Duke's head be cut off and placed on a pike on the walls of the city of York, crowned with a paper crown in a macabre parody of his royal ambition. "Let the Duke of York behold the city of York," the Queen mocked, demonstrating a cruelty that rivaled that of history's worst tyrants. The head remained exposed for months, rotting under sun and rain, while crows tore away pieces of flesh that had once housed dreams of royal grandeur. This act of desecration went far beyond military necessity or even political symbolism. Marguerite's decision to display Richard's head in such a degrading manner was designed to send a message that transcended the immediate conflict. She was declaring that she would not merely defeat her enemies, but would utterly destroy them, erasing not just their lives, but their dignity and their memory. The paper crown was a particularly vicious touch, mocking Richard's royal pretensions, while simultaneously warning others who might harbor similar ambitions. The display of Richard's head had profound psychological effects on both sides of the conflict. For Lancastrian supporters, it represented the triumph of legitimate authority over treacherous rebellion. The Queen had shown that she possessed both the power and the will to punish those who challenged royal authority, regardless of their noble birth or political connections. This demonstration of strength helped solidify support among wavering nobles who might otherwise have been tempted to join the Yorkist cause. For the Yorkists, however, the desecration of their leader's body represented an unforgivable insult that demanded revenge. The image of Richard's rotting head, crowned with mockery, became a rallying symbol that inspired his supporters to fight with unprecedented ferocity. The war was no longer about political principles or dynastic claims. It had become a personal struggle for honor and survival that could end only with the complete destruction of one side or the other. The making of a King Edward, Richard of York's eldest son, received news of his father's and brother's deaths while in Wales, gathering troops for the Yorkist cause. At 18 years old, Edward was everything his brother Edmund was not: tall, strong, charismatic, and absolutely ruthless when it came to revenge. The death of his family did not merely sadden him, but transformed him into a war machine, driven by the desire to make the Lancastrians pay for every drop of Yorkist blood spilled. Edward swore he would not rest until Marguerite of Anjou's head decorated the walls of London, in the same manner that his father's head decorated the walls of York. Edward's transformation from teenage prince to military commander was remarkable in its speed and completeness. Within weeks of learning of his father's death, he had assumed leadership of the Yorkist cause and begun implementing strategies that showed a maturity and ruthlessness far beyond his years. Unlike his father, who had retained some faith in the possibility of honorable conflict, Edward understood from the beginning that this was a war of extermination that would be won by the side most willing to embrace brutality. The young man's first challenge was consolidating his authority over the diverse coalition that had supported his father. The Yorkist party included great magnates with their own ambitions, gentry families seeking advancement, and merchants who supported the cause for economic reasons. Edward had to prove that he could lead this heterogeneous group more effectively than his father had done, while also demonstrating that he possessed the military skill to defeat the Lancastrian forces that had destroyed the previous Yorkist army. Edward's natural charisma proved crucial in meeting these challenges. Unlike his father, who had often seemed aloof and overly concerned with the niceties of his genealogical claims, Edward connected easily with people from all social levels. Soldiers followed him because he shared their hardships and led from the front. Nobles supported him because he promised them opportunities for advancement and revenge. Common people admired him because he embodied the kind of strong leadership that England seemed to need in its time of crisis. The tide turns red. The Battle of Mortimer's Cross in February 1461 was Edward's answer to the humiliation of Wakefield. The young Yorkist crushed a Lancastrian army and ordered the execution of all noble prisoners, including Owen Tudor, grandfather of the future King Henry VII. It was a clear message: the age of mercy had ended, and the Wars of the Roses would be decided not by politics or diplomacy, but by each side's ability to completely exterminate the other. Edward was learning that in a fratricidal war, survival depended not just on winning battles, but on ensuring that enemies could never rise again to fight. The battle itself demonstrated Edward's growing mastery of military tactics and psychological warfare. He positioned his forces to take advantage of a natural phenomenon that occurred during the fighting: the appearance of three suns in the sky, a meteorological effect known as a parhelion. Rather than being disturbed by this omen, Edward proclaimed it a sign of divine favor, representing the Trinity's blessing on his cause. This quick thinking transformed what could have been a demoralizing portent into a source of inspiration for his troops. The aftermath of Mortimer's Cross revealed the new brutal reality of the conflict. Edward's order to execute all noble prisoners marked a complete departure from previous practice, where high-ranking captives were routinely ransomed or exchanged. The execution of Owen Tudor was particularly significant, as Tudor was not only a Lancastrian noble, but also the stepfather of Henry VI and grandfather of Henry Tudor, who would later become Henry VII. By killing Tudor, Edward was sending a message that no one connected to the Lancastrian cause would be spared, regardless of their age or the indirect nature of their involvement. The psychological impact of these executions extended far beyond their immediate tactical value. Edward was establishing a reputation for ruthlessness that would make future enemies think twice before opposing him, while also satisfying his followers' desire for revenge. The young commander understood that in a civil war, fear could be as powerful a weapon as swords and arrows, and he was determined to make his enemies fear him more than they feared death itself. The child's verdict. Marguerite of Anjou responded with brutality that exceeded even Yorkist cruelty. At the Second Battle of St. Albans, she recaptured King Henry VI and ordered her 7-year-old son, Prince Edward, to decide the fate of Yorkist prisoners. The child, influenced by his mother's thirst for revenge, ordered the execution of nobles who had been respected knights just a few years before. Seeing a child order executions was a sign that the war had corrupted not just adults, but an entire generation that was growing up believing that violence was the only way to resolve political disputes. The scene of a 7-year-old prince pronouncing death sentences on captured enemies represented perhaps the lowest point of moral degradation in the entire conflict. Marguerite's decision to involve her son in these executions was not merely cruel, but strategically calculated. By having the heir to the throne participate in the punishment of traitors, she was making a statement about the continuity of royal authority and the price of rebellion. The message was clear. Loyalty to the Lancastrian dynasty was not just expected from the current generation, but would be demanded by future generations as well. The psychological impact of this incident on the child prince cannot be overestimated. At an age when most children are learning basic moral principles about right and wrong, Edward of Lancaster was being taught that political enemies deserved death and that showing mercy was a sign of weakness. This early exposure to extreme violence would shape his character for the rest of his short life, making him as ruthless as his mother and ensuring that the cycle of revenge would continue into the next generation. The broader implications of using a child to pronounce death sentences were equally disturbing. Medieval society placed great emphasis on the innocence of children and their protection from the harsh realities of adult conflict. By deliberately corrupting this innocence, Marguerite was violating one of the most fundamental taboos of her culture. This act alienated many who might otherwise have supported the Lancastrian cause, as it demonstrated a level of moral degradation that shocked even hardened warriors. The coronation of vengeance. Edward IV's coronation in 1461 marked the peak of Yorkist power, but also the beginning of a new phase of civil war. Edward was a popular and competent king, but his legitimacy depended entirely on his ability to keep the Lancastrians defeated. Marguerite of Anjou had fled to France with her son, where she began planning a return that would involve not just English soldiers, but also French and Scottish mercenaries, willing to fight for any cause that paid well. The Wars of the Roses were transforming into an international conflict, with foreign powers financing different English factions in the hope of weakening the kingdom that had been their enemy for centuries. Edward's coronation was a magnificent affair designed to demonstrate the legitimacy and permanence of Yorkist rule. The new king spared no expense in creating a spectacle that would impress both his subjects and foreign observers. The ceremony emphasized Edward's hereditary right to the throne through elaborate genealogical displays that traced his lineage back to Edward III, while also showcasing the military might that had brought him to power. Foreign ambassadors reported that they had never seen a more impressive display of royal magnificence. However, beneath the pomp and ceremony lay the uncomfortable reality that Edward's throne rested on military conquest rather than universal acceptance. Large parts of northern England remained loyal to the Lancastrian cause, and many nobles who had submitted to Edward's authority did so out of necessity rather than conviction. The new king understood that his reign would be secure only as long as he could prevent his enemies from regrouping and mounting a successful challenge to his authority. The international dimension of the conflict posed particular challenges for Edward's diplomacy. Marguerite's presence in France created the constant threat of foreign intervention on behalf of the Lancastrian cause. The French court had its own reasons for wanting to weaken England, and supporting a rival claimant to the English throne was an attractive way to destabilize their traditional enemy without risking open warfare. Edward had to balance his domestic security needs with the requirements of international diplomacy, often finding himself forced to make concessions to foreign powers in exchange for their neutrality. The Field of Blood. The Battle of Towton in 1461 was probably the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. More than 50,000 men faced each other on a snow-covered field, fighting for hours in horrible weather conditions. When the battle ended, more than 20,000 corpses covered the snow, staining it red for miles. Fathers had killed sons, brothers had executed brothers, and childhood friends had slaughtered each other in the name of red or white roses that meant less to them than to the nobles who commanded them. Towton was the moment when England realized it had lost not just soldiers, but a part of its national soul. The battle began in a blizzard that made it difficult for either side to assess the strength of their opponents. Edward IV had positioned his forces on high ground south of the village of Towton, while the Lancastrian army under the Duke of Somerset occupied a strong defensive position to the north. The weather conditions were so severe that soldiers could barely see their enemies until they were within sword's reach, creating a chaotic melee that lasted from dawn until dusk. The tactical turning point came when Edward's archers managed to use the wind to their advantage, sending volleys of arrows into the Lancastrian ranks while remaining out of range of return fire. This archery duel gradually wore down the Lancastrian front lines, forcing them to advance across difficult terrain into increasingly disadvantageous positions. When the hand-to-hand fighting began, the Yorkists held the tactical advantage, but the Lancastrians fought with the desperation of men who knew that defeat meant not just military failure, but probable death. The carnage at Towton was unprecedented in English warfare. Unlike previous medieval battles, where armies often disengaged when victory became clear, Towton continued until one side was completely destroyed. The snow that covered the battlefield made retreat difficult, while the bitter cold sapped the strength of wounded men who might otherwise have survived. Contemporary accounts describe streams of blood flowing down the hillsides, creating red rivulets in the white snow that remained visible for days after the battle ended. The psychological impact of Towton extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. The battle demonstrated that the English were capable of inflicting catastrophic casualties on each other, destroying the myth that civil wars were somehow less destructive than foreign conflicts. Families throughout England mourned sons, fathers, and brothers who had died fighting other Englishmen, creating a trauma that would influence the national consciousness for generations to come. The exiles' return, but not even Towton was enough to end the war. Marguerite of Anjou continued fighting from exile, organizing invasions that kept England in constant state of alert. Edward IV had to face not just external enemies, but also traitors within his own family. His brother George, Duke of Clarence, switched sides several times during the war, sometimes supporting Edward, sometimes conspiring against him with the Lancastrians. Family betrayal had become so common that no one completely trusted even their own brothers anymore. Marguerite's efforts to maintain Lancastrian resistance from French exile demonstrated remarkable persistence and political skill. Despite losing her kingdom, her husband's freedom, and most of her supporters, she continued to believe that the Lancastrian cause could be restored through a combination of foreign assistance and English discontent with Yorkist rule. Her court in exile became a center of intrigue, where displaced English nobles plotted their return, while seeking support from European powers opposed to Edward IV. The Queen's diplomatic efforts were surprisingly successful, given her desperate circumstances. She managed to secure promises of military support from both France and Scotland, traditional enemies of England, who saw opportunity in the kingdom's internal divisions. More importantly, she maintained communication with Lancastrian sympathizers within England, keeping alive the hope of restoration that would motivate future rebellions against Yorkist rule. George of Clarence's repeated betrayals illustrated how the prolonged civil war had corrupted even the most basic family relationships. As Edward IV's brother, George had benefited enormously from Yorkist victory, receiving extensive lands and titles that made him one of the wealthiest men in England. However, his ambition exceeded his loyalty, and he repeatedly conspired against his brother in pursuit of greater power. His treachery became so notorious that it inspired the saying, "false as Clarence," which entered the English language as a synonym for betrayal. The corrosive effects of George's betrayals extended throughout the Yorkist party. If the king could not trust his own brother, how could lesser nobles be confident in their relationships with each other? The constant threat of betrayal created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that made effective governance increasingly difficult, as Edward IV found himself spending more time watching for internal threats than addressing external challenges. The Princes in the Tower. The war's lowest point came when Edward IV died in 1483, and his own brothers began fighting for control of his minor children. Richard III, Edward's brother, usurped the throne and probably ordered the murder of the young princes in the Tower of London. The Princes in the Tower became symbols of how the Wars of the Roses had corrupted even the most basic instincts of family protection. Brothers killing brothers, uncles killing nephews, cousins executing cousins. England had transformed into a kingdom where kinship was more a source of danger than protection. The disappearance of Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, represented the ultimate corruption of royal family relationships. These children, aged 12 and 9 respectively, posed a threat to their uncle Richard III simply by existing, as their superior hereditary claims to the throne made them natural focal points for opposition to his rule. Richard's decision to eliminate his nephews demonstrated how thoroughly the logic of political survival had replaced natural family affection among the English royal family. The mystery surrounding the prince's fate has fascinated historians for centuries, but their disappearance's immediate impact was clear. Richard III's usurpation and the subsequent vanishing of the legitimate heirs created a legitimacy crisis that fatally weakened Yorkist rule. Many who had supported Edward IV found themselves unable to accept a king who had apparently murdered children to secure his throne, creating opportunities for Lancastrian restoration that had not existed since Towton. The broader implications of the prince's disappearance extended throughout English society. If royal uncles could murder royal nephews with impunity, what protection did ordinary families have from the predations of more powerful relatives? The incident reinforced the war's message that traditional social bonds had broken down completely, replaced by a brutal logic where survival depended on eliminating potential threats regardless of family relationships. The final reckoning. The war finally ended in 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Henry VII was a distant Lancastrian who had spent years in exile, watching his homeland destroy itself in a fratricidal war that had lasted an entire generation. His victory was not just military, but symbolic. He married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two roses into one and promising that England would never again divide against itself. But the war's scars remained for generations, reminding the English of the terrible price paid when royal families transform into mortal enemies. Henry Tudor's path to the throne illustrated how the prolonged civil war had created opportunities for previously marginal claimants. His hereditary right to the crown was tenuous at best, depending on descent from John of Gaunt through a line that had been legitimized only retrospectively. Under normal circumstances, such a distant claim would have been laughable, but the Wars of the Roses had eliminated so many more direct heirs that Henry found himself the best available Lancastrian candidate. The Battle of Bosworth Field was decided as much by betrayal as by military prowess. Richard III found himself abandoned by key supporters at the crucial moment, most notably by Thomas Stanley, whose decision to switch sides during the battle sealed the Yorkist king's fate. Richard's death in combat, he was the last English king to die fighting, ended the Yorkist dynasty and cleared the way for Tudor rule, but it also demonstrated that the pattern of betrayal and shifting loyalties that had characterized the entire conflict continued to its very end. Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth of York was a masterstroke of political symbolism that helped heal the wounds of civil war. By uniting the rival roses in his coat of arms and his marriage bed, the new king offered England a narrative of reconciliation that transcended the bitter divisions of the previous 3 decades. However, the success of this symbolic union depended on Henry's ability to eliminate remaining threats to his rule and establish a new model of monarchy that would prevent future civil wars. The price of victory. The Wars of the Roses cost England more than lives and treasure. They destroyed confidence in royal authority, eliminated much of the old medieval nobility, and created a political culture where betrayal and violence were seen as legitimate tools of governance. When the war ended, England was a different country from what it had been in 1455. It had lost its medieval innocence and gained a brutal understanding that political power was something for which people would kill not just strangers, but also those they loved most. The demographic impact of the wars was catastrophic for the English nobility. Entire families disappeared from the historical record, their male lines extinguished in battles or executions. The great magnate families that had dominated English politics for centuries were either destroyed or so weakened that they never recovered their former influence. This destruction of the old aristocracy created opportunities for new families to rise, but it also eliminated much of the institutional memory and political expertise that had provided stability to the medieval English state. The economic consequences of the prolonged conflict were equally severe. 3 decades of intermittent warfare had disrupted trade, destroyed property, and diverted resources from productive activities to military expenditure. Many regions of England bore the scars of military campaigns for years after the fighting ended, with abandoned villages and uncultivated fields serving as reminders of the war's destructive power. The costs of reconstruction would burden English society for generations. Perhaps most importantly, the Wars of the Roses fundamentally changed English political culture. The medieval ideal of noble honor, which had theoretically restrained political competition within civilized bounds, had been thoroughly discredited by the events of the Civil War. Future English monarchs would rule through different methods, relying more on bureaucratic efficiency and less on feudal loyalty. The Tudor dynasty that emerged from the conflict would create new forms of royal authority that were both more centralized and more suspicious of potential rivals than their medieval predecessors. The bitter irony. The most bitter irony of the Wars of the Roses is that they began as an attempt to save England from a mad king and ended up nearly destroying the very concept of English monarchy. Richard of York sincerely believed he was saving his country by challenging Henry VI, but his actions unleashed 3 decades of violence that killed more Englishmen than any foreign war. Marguerite of Anjou fought fiercely to protect her son's rights, but her brutal tactics transformed a dynastic dispute into an extermination conflict that nearly eliminated both Lancastrians and Yorkists. The tragic irony extended to nearly every major figure in the conflict. Richard of York, who began the war to restore strong government to England, died having plunged the kingdom into its worst period of governmental chaos since the Norman conquest. Edward IV, who achieved the military victory his father had sought, found himself constantly defending his throne against the very forces his family's rebellion had unleashed. Even Henry VII, the ultimate victor, spent his entire reign haunted by the fear that others would use violence against him, just as he had used it to gain the crown. The war's outcome bore little resemblance to what any of its original participants had intended. Richard of York had wanted to reform the government, not destroy the monarchy. Marguerite of Anjou had sought to preserve her son's inheritance, not eliminate her husband's dynasty. Edward IV had aimed to establish a stable Yorkist succession, not create conditions that would lead to his children's disappearance. The gap between intentions and results illustrated how civil wars develop their own logic that transcends the original goals of their participants. The lasting legacy. Today, when we visit the fields where these battles were fought, it is difficult to imagine the horror that unfolded in those now peaceful places. Wakefield is now a prosperous industrial city. Towton is a green field where sheep graze peacefully, and Bosworth is a well-maintained park with explanatory signs for tourists. But beneath this superficial tranquility still rest the bones of thousands of Englishmen who died fighting other Englishmen in a war that began between 2 brothers and ended by forever changing the character of the English nation. The physical landscape of England still bears subtle traces of the Wars of the Roses. Archaeological excavations at battle sites continue to uncover mass graves filled with the skeletal remains of soldiers who fell during these conflicts, their bones telling silent stories of violent deaths from sword wounds, arrow strikes, and blunt force trauma. At Towton, the largest battle ever fought on English soil, archaeologists have discovered evidence of the systematic slaughter that occurred when one army broke and fled. Skulls crushed by war hammers, vertebrae severed by swords, and arm bones shattered in desperate attempts to ward off fatal blows. These grim discoveries remind us that behind the romantic myths and literary adaptations of the Wars of the Roses lay a brutal reality of hand-to-hand combat, where neighbours killed neighbours and brothers spilled brothers' blood across the English countryside. The castles and manor houses that served as strongholds during the conflict still dot the English landscape like stone monuments to a vanished world of feudal power and aristocratic ambition. Many bear the scars of siege warfare. Walls damaged by primitive cannons, arrow slits widened to accommodate early firearms, and hastily constructed defensive earthworks that speak to the desperate improvisations of defenders under attack. These architectural remnants serve as physical reminders of how the Wars of the Roses marked the transition from medieval to early modern warfare, a period when traditional knightly combat gave way to the gunpowder weapons that would dominate European battlefields for the next 4 centuries. Hit that like button and subscribe for more dark tales from history's bloodiest family feuds.